All right, guys, welcome. This is Chapter 26 of Remembering Survival Inside a Nazi Slave Labor Camp by Christopher Browning. This chapter is called Escapees, and it's narrated to you by Carter Banks. And here we go. Chapter 26, Escapees. While the vast majority of Jewish slave laborers still alive in the Strakowice camps in late July 1944 were shipped to Birkenau, and most of those who tried to escape in the last week did not survive the desperate breakout attempts, some prisoners did reach the forest. They, like the few other prisoners who had successfully risked escape earlier, then faced the daunting ordeal of surviving on the outside until the Soviet army, which had seemed so close, but then expectedly stopped its offensive on the Vistula River, less than 40 miles to the east, finally arrived in Strakowice nearly 6 months later, on January 18, 1945. It is to the experiences of a few of the surviving escapees, both those who had left earlier, as well as those of July 1944, that we turn. There are three patterns of survival among those who escaped at some point before July 1944. Entering another camp, passing as Polish workers in Germany, or being hidden by courageous Poles. When the Ostrowiec ghetto was being liquidated in October 1942, 110 Jewish workers had been selected and taken to Strakowice to work on the construction of the labor camps there before liquidation of the Wiersbennik ghetto. Irving Weinberg subsequently learned that members of his family were still alive in the small ghetto in Ostrowiec, and he made plans to escape and rejoin them. He eluded the Ukrainian guards and caught a night train to Ostrowiec. Seeing Germans at the station there, he waited to jump off the moving train as it departed. He joined a column of Jews marching to work and was then reunited with his family in the ghetto. Barak Blumenstock was in the same Ostrowiec contingent, unable to sleep at night due to the huge lice all over his body and assigned to bathing shell casings in acid. He felt he would never survive Strelnica, so he resolved to escape. At a change of shift, he slipped among the Polish workers, leaving the factory. Spotting Germans on the train station, he set out on foot and eventually received a wagon ride. A Pole who joined the ride near Ostrowiec recognized him and took him home for a meal before advising him how to get into the ghetto. There he joined 4 cousins and a wealthy uncle, so he did not go hungry. Eventually, both Weinberg and Blumenstock lost all of their families in Ostrowiec and ended up by different routes in Auschwitz and then Germany. In Opatow, Joseph Cernikowski's family had consciously decided to separate in the hope that at least someone in the family would survive. He opted for Strakowice and bought a seat in one of Leopold Schwertner's trucks in the spring of 1943 when he learned that his sister was still alive in a camp for agricultural laborers near Sandomierz. He resolved to join her. A Pole he had befriended at work offered to help. Joseph jumped the camp fence and joined his friend, who bought train tickets, accompanied him to Sandomierz, and helped him locate his sister's camp. A Jewish policeman let him in, and after some negotiations, he was entered on the camp's list and became legal. When the camp was closed, he transferred to a labor camp at Pioniki, from where he was loaded on a train for Auschwitz in July 1944. He jumped from the train after it had crossed into the incorporated territories that had been annexed to the Third Reich. Once again, provided crucial help by several Poles, he eventually made his way across southern Poland to the Russian lines, where he encountered two other Strachowicza escapees, the Einesberg brothers. Mania Iser, who had long been preparing to escape and hence had her clothing and money ready, had slipped out of Wierzbnik in the early hours of October 27, 1942, and heard the screams of the ghetto liquidation while hiding in a woodshed. With the payment of money, she persuaded her very reluctant Polish host to let her stay for 5 days. She traveled to Lwów in vain pursuit of a cousin, then to Warsaw in vain pursuit of a safe hiding place. Finally, she returned to Wierzbnik and contacted her family in Tartak, but they advised her not to enter the camp. Taken off the train on her way back to Warsaw, she was sent to Germany as a Polish forced laborer. A native of Lwów, Luciana Berkowitz, had been transferred with her husband Daniel from Wallenau to Strachowicza in the summer of 1943, where she survived an abortion and the Fairliege selection. Fearing her supervisor, a Polish nationalist who had already denounced one of his Jewish female workers, but offered help by her Polish foreman, Ignaz Gura, she decided to attempt an escape. She was blonde and could hope to pass, while her husband was typically Jewish in appearance and could not hope to join her. To pay for her escape, he smuggled and sold a revolver from the blacksmith shop where he'd worked. She was transferred to a team assigned to outside work digging potatoes. Ignaz Gura met her in the potato field, but the Jewish policeman Abraham Wilczek appeared and threatened to take her back to camp unless she took his girlfriend with her. Luciana refused. Abraham relented, and Gura took her to a family friend for hiding. The next day, two other Poles took her by the train to Warsaw. The Pole who was to hide her there lost his nerve, so after paying for an identification card, she reported to the labor office and volunteered for work in Germany. Of the early escapees, only one is known to have survived in hiding in Poland until the end of the war, and even then, just barely. Tima Lichtenstein was among the expellees from Pluck. In the fall of 1943, her Polish foreman offered to help her escape. A fellow Jew from Pluck gave her the signal when she could safely peel off from the march to work without being seen. She was then taken to the village of Bronkowitz, where she was hidden by Teofil Nowak, but her presence raised suspicion. A villager who had spotted two Jews emerging from the forest asked her to detain them in conversation while he fetched his gun. She instead warned them to run back into the forest, fearing that she would denounce him to the Russians when they arrived, and the villager preemptively reported her to the Germans. She and her guardian Novak were arrested and imprisoned in Strachowicza. In the truck on the way to Strachowicza, Novak warned her not to believe the interrogators if they said he had already confessed that she was a Jew. He would die before he gave her away, he promised. Both were subjected to lengthy interrogation and finally released on January 12, 1945. They were afraid to return to Bronkowitz until the Russians had arrived, after which they were received in the village with a big party. In July 1944, the arrival of the Soviet army seemed imminent, so the Germans moved to evacuate the camps. For those who risked trying to escape at this time, it was not an unreasonable calculation that they would have to survive on the outside for only a few days or weeks at most. Instead, the Soviet army halted on the Vistula River for 6 months. Thus, Strachowicza and the surrounding area were not liberated until mid-January of 1945. For those who had escaped in the final days before evacuation of the factory camp, there were again three patterns of survival: flight eastward to the Soviet lines, hiding, and joining the partisans. Most fortunate in this regard were the Eisenberg brothers, Yashil and Mielek, who came from Iwaniska, just west of the Vistula. They were among those who participated in nighttime breakouts from Strakavica and reached the fence but retreated back into the camp when the guards opened fire. However, they successfully got through the fence and into the forest during the daylight breakout the following day. They walked to the southeast in order to return to Iwaniska. Mielak knew the territory, since he had worked the region as a horse trader before the war. Thus, when they reached the outskirts of Iwaniska, they were allowed to stay in the stables of a farm where he had traded horses before the war. By good fortune, an advanced party of Soviet cavalry reached Iwaniska, and there they were liberated. Finding the town very depressing and hearing rumors that Germans were about to reoccupy the region, they wisely resumed their trip eastward and reached the safety of the Soviet line just weeks after their escape. Leib Feintuch and his brother also failed to escape during the nighttime breakout, but managed to get through the fence the following day, immediately following Baumgarten's speech. They went to various villages where Poles would give them food out of fear of the Soviets, who were expected to arrive soon, but they would not let the Jews hide out of fear of the Germans, who were still nearby. By then, part of a small group of fugitives, they contacted a partisan band that said it would take Jews. Instead, the Jews were forced to surrender all their valuables, and one Jew who was found to have kept one bill sewn into his clothing was shot. The rest were told to scatter and run. Leib and his brother continued eastward, receiving help along the way until they reached Russian lines on August 15th. For those who did not move eastward and reach the Russian lines, but sought instead to hide locally, the wait for liberation was longer and more precarious. In Tartak, when Naftullah Korenwasser looked out a window near the machine at which he was working, he saw the trucks approaching. He ran to pick up his wife, and together they escaped across the creek behind the lumberyard before the camp was surrounded. A Polish policeman was sent on the Ostrowiec-Skarżysko highway, which they had to cross before they could reach the forest. Naftullah asked him if he wanted them on his conscience, and he did not shoot. They proceeded to the village from which his wife had come. One farm couple let them stay in the hayloft for a few nights, but then they had to leave before the couple's son, an anti-Semite and a member of the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, or AK, returned. Naftullah then was helped by several Poles with whom he had served in the army, one of whom provided a pick and a shovel to dig an underground bunker in the forest. Speaking the local dialect, his wife, now joined by her sister, did tailoring for farmers in the area, and eventually Naftullah began to do skilled carpentry work as well. When a less skilled carpenter threatened to denounce Naftullah, the locals dealt with him, since they did not want to lose Naftullah's valuable services. Hence, they survived until the first Soviet troop arrived on January 17. Yakov Shavshevitz was one of the very few Strakavica prisoners who made good his escape in the nighttime breakout. He made his way back to his hometown in Slidowick, where during the still warm summer months he slept under the open sky and encountered various former schoolmates who exclaimed, "Yakov, you're alive!" But none dared to hide him, as, truth to tell, the danger for them was really great. He was joined by another fugitive Jew, and together they paid a poor peasant to hide them in his barn. They gave him all the money we possessed, as well as a wristwatch, but after 2 weeks he demanded more. Unable to pay, the two Jews were given the ultimatum to go and steal from a wealthy neighbor for whom the peasant had worked. In the end, by virtue of carrying out 2 robberies on behalf of their host, Yakov and his companion retained their hiding place until the Soviets arrived. Quick note, that's kind of related, kind of unrelated. It's not part of the book, but there is a book that it's fiction based on it's pretty damn close to what actually happened, but it's a fiction of, it's a narrative about, peasants and basically 2 parents who are about to be deported from a ghetto to, I think, Auschwitz or something. They send their son into the countryside with peasants, and it really gives you some insight as to the kind of barbarism that kind of went on in all the other towns. It was everyone for themselves, but yeah, the book's called The Painted Bird by Jerzy Kaczynski. I would recommend reading it, but it's also really fucked up, so do with that what you will. Back to the book. Also, during the night breakout, Jacob Sebetowicz used his pre-war experience in the Polish army to slip under the barbed wire without getting entangled, and made his way back to the family home in Smilau, near Radom, from which the Germans had evicted his family much earlier. There he found that the Germans were still in his house, and that his neighbors were all too afraid to hide him. He returned to Strachowicza, rummaged through the now empty barracks for food and clothing, and then went to the old janitor from the factory who let him stay in his barn until the Soviets arrived. Mendel Minkberg, son of former head of the Judenrat in Wiersbenich, was at the factory when the Jewish foreman of his department warned him that the camp was surrounded and he should not return to the barracks. Without a chance to plan, he and several other Jews slipped out of the factory and over the fence. Ukrainian guards spotted them as they crossed the road and opened fire, but in the growing darkness they made good their escape. Since 2 of the escapees were from Bolzentine, they crossed the Kamiena River and headed for that town, where they found shelter in the cowshed of a Polish woman who was promised payment after liberation. After 3 weeks, when the hoped-for liberation had not come, the increasingly frightened Polish woman insisted that the hidden Jews shift to an underground hiding place much farther from her house. Out of money for food, Mendel returned to Wiersbenich one night to seek help from a friend. When he returned to the hiding place, he discovered that it had been raided by partisans, and 2 of his companions had been killed. His friend in Wiersbenich procured identification papers for him, and he worked as a Polish agricultural worker near Iza. On several occasions, his employer was obligated to provide a horse and wagon to transport Germans from Strachowicza and Wiersbenich. Minkberg was sent as the coachman to pick them up. Gentile acquaintances recognized Minkberg, but no one gave him away, so he survived. Like Leib Fintuk, whose brief encounter with a partisan band cost him all his money, but not his life, other escapees who tried to survive by joining a partisan group ran the grave and probable risk of encountering the wrong group, while a few partisan groups in the forests, usually those associated with the AL, Armia Ludowa, the communist-oriented underground, would accept Jews. Those associated with the AK, the conservative nationalist underground home army, usually rejected them. More dangerously, some AK units, and especially extremist units associated with the notorious National Armed Forces NSZ would either rob Jews or simply kill them outright. Jacob Binstock and Chaim Salzberg were among a group of prisoners who planned a successful escape directly to the factory in the forest with the goal of joining the partisans. The leader of the first group they encountered told them it was a big mistake to come to the forest without guns, and furthermore, he did not take Jews. At least he was honest, Chaim noted, but the partisan leader did not give them directions to another partisan who he thought was Jewish. They encountered a group of Soviet parachutists led by the Yiddish-speaking Bolek. He had no guns to spare, but before he moved on, he gave them valuable advice on how to survive in the forest. After various close calls, Jacob and Chaim finally were taken into a large AL unit of Mieczysław Moczar, a prominent leader in the Polish Communist Party and in its post-war security apparatus, and they fought in the area until the unit was ordered to cross over to the Soviet side in December, before the imminent Red Army offensive. David Solly was among those who escaped from Tartak before the prisoners there were taken to the factory camp. His group swelled in numbers, which caused the local peasants from whom they were asking for food to complain to a nearby AK unit that they were being harassed by Jewish partisans. The AK unit surrounded the Jewish escapees and threatened to kill them if they continued to demand food from the villagers. 6 of the escapees asked to join the AK group, and ostensibly were welcomed. 4 days later, the bodies of all 6 were found near the village. The Jews then tried to join a partisan group associated with the communists. The advanced party that they encountered simply took all their possessions. The commander of the unit eventually restored their stolen items, but still would not let them join. They finally encountered a third group that would permit them to join if they acquired weapons. When they captured 5 weapons from a careless German requisition party, the group of 37 Jewish men and 3 Jewish girls were allowed to become members. This turned out, once again, to be the large communist unit of Mieczysław Moczar, made up of Poles, Jews, and escaped Soviet POWs of different nationalities. Even in this mixed unit, on one mission, several Polish members took the opportunity to murder a Jewish comrade. When this was uncovered, however, 2 Poles were executed. Abraham Scheiner had slipped through the fence unnoticed shortly before Baumgarten's speech, watched the daylight break out attempts from the forest, and then fled north to the Isa region with 2 other escapees. Most villagers they approached would neither give nor sell them food and instead informed the Germans, but a small number provided enough help to stay alive. Hoping to join the partisans to fight a common enemy, Scheiner instead found himself at risk of being murdered by the partisans themselves. First, his group was caught by the AK partisans, whose commander warned them that villagers had complained of being robbed, and he would kill them if they did it again. A few days later, they fell into the hands of an NSZ unit, but Scheiner bluffed that there was a Vlasov unit of German collaborators nearby who would come if they heard shots, and the NSZ partisans quickly fled. A third time, they narrowly escaped death at the hands of common murderous bandits, whom also shared the forests. Finally, he and his companion, Ari Lustgarten, decided to head for the Russian lines. When Abraham fell ill with a high fever and was no longer able to walk, the 2 were taken in by the Yaziersky family. While Abraham recovered, Ari worked in the fields for the family. As neighbors became suspicious, the Yazierskys decided they could not hide more than 1 Jew. They helped Abraham find his way to a group of Soviet partisans. Abraham Rosenwald likewise encountered a bewildering array of different groups in the forest after he escaped from Tartak. First, he encountered Bolek, who would not take his group of Jews since they had no weapons. A second partisan group robbed them of their few possessions. To live, we went to the fields and gathered potatoes. The peasants ambushed us and beat us up. A third group of partisans murdered one of Abraham's companions, Israel Rosenberg, because they coveted his clothes. In one village, they encountered a fourth group of partisans, whose commander would not let them join, but nonetheless gave them some grenades for self-defense. Members of a fifth group of partisans robbed them once again, but this time the commander returned the stolen goods. A sixth partisan group agreed to take any Jews with prior military experience, but subsequently murdered them. Abraham was finally allowed to join a seventh group, from whom he received rifle training, but he became separated in escaping a German encirclement. An eighth group, led by Piotr, allowed Jews to join, but only to perform menial work, not fight. And the Jews were not allowed to stay with Piotr when he crossed over to the Russian lines. At this point, Abraham encountered Shlomo Einesman, who had left his hiding place. Einesman suggested that the others return to the hiding place with him, since he had sufficient money. Instead, Abraham persisted in going east, and this time made it across to the Soviets. Several escapees were able to take an active role with partisans in fighting the Germans. Abraham Wilczek, the elder son of Jeremiah Wilczek, was among a group of 10 young men who made it through the fence into the forest during the daylight breakout, and thereby probably saved himself from sharing the same fate as his father and younger brother on the train to Auschwitz. When they tried to join a partisan group, it would only take 2 of them, including Abraham. He became an expert in the dangerous job of placing explosives on bridges and rail lines. When he then became seriously ill, he was left behind by his group, which was fleeing an anti-partisan sweep by columns of Central Asian auxiliaries of the German army. However, Poles took him in for 10 days until his fever broke. When he tried to rejoin his band, he discovered that they all had been denounced and killed. He alone of the group survived until Soviet troops arrived in January. The very last successful escapee before the Strachowitz Jews reached Birkenau was Shmuel Chaim Wolfowitz, a native of eastern Poland near Baranowitz, who had arrived in Strachowitz as part of the Lublin contingent in the spring of 1944. He was in one of the very crowded and hot cattle cars that departed Strachowitz on July 28 and decided to risk jumping. Others lifted him up to the small window from which he leapt and rolled down the embankment. Making his way back towards Strachowitz, he begged for food in villages, speaking Russian to appear as an escaped Soviet POW rather than a Jew, or stole potatoes from fields. In the forest, he helped a surrounded partisan unit find a way out of its encirclement. At first, the unit tried to chase him away, but eventually it let him join. And finally, he inherited a rifle from a very sick comrade. Thereafter, he fought and rose to command his own group, before finally being ordered to go over to the Soviet lines. Among the 2,200 Jews who passed through the Strachowitz factory slave labor camps, very few tried to escape. After all, many had purchased work permits just to get into one of these camps, where working for the Germans in the munitions industry that was key to the war effort was judged to offer the best chance for survival. It was not particularly difficult to get out of these camps. Many Jews left and re-entered repeatedly, but surviving on the outside for any length of time was extremely difficult and dangerous. Long-term hiding faced almost insuperable odds, so most of those who survived an early escape did so by virtue of working either in Germany or in another labor camp in Poland. Even the late escapees, who had to survive just under 6 months on the outside, faced great odds. Ultimately, not only did few prisoners attempt escape, but among those who did, few survived until liberation. One factor in the steep odds against survival on the outside brings the historian again to the complex issue of Jewish-Polish relations. Fear of denunciation by hostile Poles was one of those great deterrents to escape. Indeed, among those who escaped, many experienced not only denunciation, but robbery and even murder. Others, however, encountered Poles who not only did not denounce them, but even provided short-term help. Even these non-hostile and supportive Poles, however, would not provide long-term shelter, primarily out of tremendous fear of the dangers to which the long-term hiding of Jews would expose them and their families. Even so, virtually every escapee who did survive received, and often more than once, crucial help from Poles, without whom they would not have survived. And the Poles who did so usually received no benefit commensurate to the risk they incurred. Escaped Jews may have experienced much hostility and danger from Poles, but those who survived were also the recipients of many acts of courage and altruism. And that concludes Chapter 26 and Part 5 of Christopher R. Browning's Remembering Survival in a Nazi Slave Labor Camp. Thanks for joining me tonight, you guys, and don't get the coronavirus.